I used to believe every family had a line they would never cross, a moment where love finally outweighed pride, money, ego, or convenience. I believed that line existed for my family too. I believed it right up until the night a cardiologist looked me in the eyes and told me my 9-year-old son would die without a treatment I could not afford. That was the moment when everything I thought I knew about my own blood cracked open. If you want to know how far a family will go to pretend they are good people, listen closely, because mine taught me a lesson I will never forget. My name is Rachel Moore. I am 32 years old, a single mom, and a high school counselor in Denver. I do not come from chaos or cruelty. At least, that is what I used to tell myself. My parents, Robert and Linda, always projected a polished version of our lives. Sunday church, family photos on the mantle, matching sweaters at Christmas, love that looked real from a distance. But the truth is, some families learn to perform love the way actors perform a script. And the moment life stops matching the script, everything falls apart. The unraveling began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late February. I remember the smell of disinfectant in the hallway, the weight of Liam leaning into me as we walked, and the steady beep of machines behind every door we passed. Liam had been tired for weeks, more than a 9-year-old should ever be. He slept through school, complained that his chest felt tight, and struggled to catch his breath after climbing one flight of stairs. His pediatrician sent us to a specialist. The specialist sent us to the hospital. The hospital sent us to a cardiologist. And the cardiologist gave us news that redefined every part of my life. "Your son has a rare heart condition," he said gently. "There is an experimental treatment that has shown success, but your insurance will not cover it. The cost is $90,000. I remember blinking at him, as if the number alone should have made the walls collapse. 90,000. More money than I had ever seen. More money than any single mother working 3 jobs could find. I asked how long we had. He said not long. Weeks, maybe a few months if everything went perfectly. Nothing in his eyes suggested that things would go perfectly. That night I sat beside Liam in his hospital bed and watched him sleep. His eyelashes fluttered the way they always had. His breath whistled softly through his nose. He hugged his old stuffed koala against his chest. He looked perfectly alive, perfectly 9, and I felt something inside me split open. A mother should never have to choose between hope and money. But that is exactly what I was being forced to do. Then came the moment that still echoes in my mind. The moment that became the hook for the story I am telling you now. It happened when the doctor stepped out and my phone buzzed with a family group chat message from my younger sister, Madison. "Wedding update. We just put down the deposit for the venue in Greece. $250,000. Dad says sky is the limit. Best day ever." I reread it 3 times. $250,000. The exact same people who told me last month that they needed to be careful with money. The same parents who lectured me about budgeting. The same parents I was about to call to ask for help. And suddenly I understood something sharp and ugly about where I stood in this family. Hope was optional for my son, but fireworks and a cliffside ceremony over the Aegean Sea were not optional for my sister. I tried to breathe, but it felt like the air had been vacuumed out of the room. I knew what I had to do next. I had to beg. I had to call my parents and explain that the treatment was Liam's only chance, and I had to believe, truly believe, that they would come through for their grandson, that they would choose life over luxury. I called them from the hallway outside the pediatric wing. I told them everything. I told them about the diagnosis, the treatment, the timeline, the cost. For a long moment they said nothing. Then my father finally exhaled and said the words that still ring in my ears. "Rachel, you have to be realistic. We cannot drain our retirement for something that might not even work." I felt my knees weaken. I pressed my hand against the wall and tried to steady myself. I reminded them they had just spent $250,000 on a wedding. My mother cut me off with a tone that felt like a slap. "That is different. This is Madison's big moment. We are not choosing between you and her. Life just works out this way sometimes. We will pray for Liam." Prayers. That was what my parents offered my dying child. If you are still listening, here is the hook that keeps people from turning away. This was the moment I understood that my family would let my son die before they let my sister's wedding lose its sparkle. And once you see the truth about the people who raised you, you can never unsee it. I hung up the phone, wiped my face, and walked back into the room where Liam slept peacefully, unaware that his life had just been priced and deemed too expensive. And as I stood there in that dim, humming hospital room, I made myself a promise. I would save him if I could. And if I could not, then one day, somehow, the truth would come back for the people who pretended they had none. That was the night everything in me changed. And the night this story truly began. If losing hope once was painful, losing it over and over again became its own kind of quiet torture. After that phone call with my parents, something inside me shifted. I stopped expecting rescue. I stopped believing that love automatically meant action. But even then, in the deepest part of me, there was still a small voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, they would show up when they truly understood how bad things were. That hope died slowly over the next few weeks. Every morning I left the hospital to shower at home before work. I still had bills. I still had students who needed me, and every evening I hurried back to Liam's bedside, praying he would still be awake when I walked in. Some nights he was. Some nights he was too tired to speak. The circles under his eyes grew darker. His breath grew shallower. Time was slipping through my hands like sand, and I could not stop it. Meanwhile, my family group chat was buzzing non-stop. Not about Liam, not about the treatment, not even a single question about how he was doing. No, they talked about bachelorette party themes, about floral centerpieces flown in from Italy, about custom gold leaf menus printed on handmade paper. And my personal favorite, whether fireworks reflected better off the water during the blue hour or just after sunset. I muted the chat more times than I can count, but it didn't matter. Madison would call me directly if I didn't react fast enough. "Rachel, what do you think of these bridesmaid dresses?" "Rachel, you'll help with the honeymoon registry video, right?" "Rachel, don't be weird about the money. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event." She said that last part on a day when Liam collapsed, trying to get out of bed to use the bathroom. I carried him back to the mattress in my arms, my heart pounding, and when my phone buzzed again, I felt something inside me splinter. How could she speak of a once-in-a-lifetime event when my son might not have a lifetime left? But here is the part that still stuns me when I look back. The true hook. The moment that made me realize my family had not merely drifted from reality, they had built an entire fantasy world where suffering did not exist unless it threatened their fun. It happened one afternoon about 2 weeks after the diagnosis. I had left work early because the school nurse called, saying Liam was struggling to stay awake during tutoring sessions she volunteered to give him. When I reached the hospital, Dr. Patel was reviewing the latest test results. His face was calm, but not in a reassuring way, more like the stillness before a storm. He explained that Liam's heart was weakening faster than expected. The window for the treatment was narrowing. If I could gather the money soon, he said, there was still a real chance. I left his office with shaking hands. I had already sold my car. I had already taken on extra counseling hours. I had launched a crowdfunding page that had raised barely a fraction of what was needed. I was drowning, but I was still swimming as hard as I could. Then my mother called. Her voice was bright, cheerful, rehearsed in a way that told me she had been practicing whatever she was about to say. "Rachel, honey, I hope you'll be able to make it to the engagement brunch this Saturday. We're arranging a big surprise for Madison. Everyone is coming. Don't be dramatic about the hospital. Just take a little break." A break. From watching my son fight to stay alive. I nearly laughed, and it sounded so wrong in that sterile hallway that I had to cover my mouth. I told her I couldn't go. I told her Liam was declining. I told her we might be running out of time. She sighed loudly. "Rachel, you cannot keep making everything so heavy. We all have lives too. We cannot stop the world every time you hit a rough patch." When I hung up, my hands were cold. I walked back into Liam's room and saw him coloring a picture of a mountain with a sky full of stars. His hand trembled slightly, but he was smiling, determined to act normal. I knelt beside him and helped steady the crayon. "Mom, will I still get to go hiking when my heart is fixed?" he asked. I swallowed hard and told him yes. I would have promised him anything. That night, when he had finally fallen asleep, I opened the family group chat again. Just one more time. Just to see whether maybe anyone had said something human. The newest message was from my father. "Everyone, good news. I upgraded the wedding gift to include a yacht day for the family. It is going to be incredible. "We deserve this. We deserve this." Those 3 words settled into my chest like ice. My son was dying, and my parents believed the universe owed them a yacht, and that was when the real hook hit me. The moment I realized the story was no longer about asking for help, it was about learning who my parents truly were. People who believed weddings deserved extravagance, while a child fighting for breath deserved patience, budget concerns, and silence. From that moment on, I stopped expecting compassion. I stopped waiting for the miracle of their conscience. The only thing I cared about was Liam, but the more time passed, the more obvious it became. I could not save him alone. And my family, the people who should have stood beside me, were already thousands of miles away in their minds, sailing across the Aegean on a boat my son would never live to see. That was the beginning of the end. For them. And for the version of me who still believed blood meant loyalty. And if you think their silence was the worst thing they could do, wait until you hear what they did next. That is where the story truly turns. There is a strange kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who claim to love you, yet move through life as if your pain is only background noise. After those weeks of muted calls, ignored updates, and the endless wedding chatter, I stopped trying to make my family understand. I turned inward. I focused on Liam. But even then, the world around us continued spinning, indifferent to the fact that mine was falling apart. Hospital days blurred into one another. The air always smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Every morning, I checked the monitors before I even kissed Liam's forehead. Every evening, I watched nurses adjust tubes and wires with the calm precision of people who see far too many children slip through their fingers. Some nights I would leave the room just to breathe in a hallway that felt less suffocating. Other nights I stayed awake in the chair beside his bed, counting the seconds between each of his shallow breaths. And through all of this, my phone never stopped buzzing. But it wasn't my parents asking for updates. It wasn't my sister wondering if she could visit. It wasn't anyone who shared Liam's blood. It was Instagram notifications, photos from Madison, from my mother, from relatives I barely spoke to, all celebrating the countdown to the wedding of the century. I saw images of tiered cakes taller than my son, champagne towers shaped like sculptures, hair and makeup trials, dress fittings, an entire wall covered in roses imported from Italy. My mother's caption on one post read, "We are so blessed, nothing but joy this season." Joy. That was the word they chose. That same day, Liam had fainted during a short walk from his bed to the bathroom. I had caught him just before he hit the floor. His lips had gone pale. His hands were cold. I had yelled for a nurse, my heart hammering so violently that I thought I might collapse too. Later that night, while he slept with a thin oxygen tube hooked under his nose, I scrolled through their smiling photos again. Something inside me hardened. Resentment? Yes. Anger? Absolutely. But deeper than that was a grief no one had prepared me for. It wasn't just losing my son piece by piece. It was losing the illusion that the people I loved were capable of loving us back. The next morning, Dr. Patel called me into his office. He didn't smile. He didn't use soft language. He didn't try to cushion anything. "Liam's heart is failing faster than expected," he said. "We are approaching a point where treatment may not be possible." I stared at him, numb. I asked if more time would help, if waiting could stabilize him, if anything could slow down what was happening. He shook his head. If the treatment was going to work, it needed to happen soon. He reminded me of the cost, the $90,000 that stood between hope and the unthinkable. I left his office feeling hollow, as if grief had carved out everything inside me but the instinct to keep moving forward. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I tried again. I texted my parents. I called. I emailed them the doctor's exact words. I explained that we were nearly out of time, and once again, silence. Hours passed, then a day, then 2. Their eventual response came not through a call or a private message, but through a photo posted online. A family lunch celebrating the final wedding menu tasting. My mother had written, "We are choosing joy at every step." A painful laugh escaped me, one I couldn't control. Choosing joy. What a luxury. I sat beside Liam's bed, watching his chest rise and fall beneath the thin blanket. His eyelashes fluttered. His small fingers twitched. I brushed his hair back and whispered that I was doing everything I could. He opened his eyes. Barely. and asked if Grandma and Grandpa were coming to visit soon. My throat tightened. I told him they were busy but that they loved him. The lie tasted bitter. He nodded quietly, accepting it without question. That night, after Liam fell asleep, I stepped into the hallway to breathe. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Madison. "Need your help with my rehearsal dinner speech. You're good with emotional stuff. Call me when you can." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. That was the moment the hook hit me. The moment everything sharpened into clarity. The moment I realized my family wasn't just distracted. They were living a story where my reality didn't fit, where my son didn't fit, where my pain wasn't an inconvenience but an interruption to their narrative of perfection. And once you understand that someone's story has no room for you, you stop trying to squeeze yourself into the margins. When I walked back into Liam's room, he was sleeping soundly, his hand curled around his stuffed koala. I sat down beside him and whispered a promise into the dark. I told him I wasn't giving up. I told him he mattered. I told him he would never be forgotten, no matter what happened. Over the next week, things only got harder. Liam grew weaker. His energy faded. The machines around him seemed louder, more insistent. Every beep felt like a countdown. And through it all, my family laughed into cameras, toasted champagne flutes, and planned yacht excursions. They weren't just absent, they were celebrating while my son slipped away. If you think that is the worst of it, it isn't. Not even close. Because the moment that broke me, the moment that changed everything was still waiting just ahead. And when it came, it shattered my world in a way I never imagined possible. The week everything broke began quietly, the way storms sometimes do. There was no dramatic shift at first, no sudden collapse, just a gradual dimming in Liam, like someone lowering a light one notch at a time, until you suddenly realize the room is nearly dark. Only when I look back do I understand how quickly it all unraveled. On Monday morning, I walked into Liam's room and saw him staring at the ceiling instead of coloring or watching his cartoons. His eyes were open, but distant, as if he couldn't quite stay anchored to the world. When I touched his hand, it was colder than usual. He tried to smile, but even the attempt looked exhausting. "Mom, am I getting better yet?" he asked in a whisper. I told him yes. I didn't even hesitate. Because what else can a mother say when the truth is too cruel to speak aloud, and because I still hadn't made peace with the fact that hope was shrinking faster than time. By Wednesday, he could barely sit up. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow waves, and every breath seemed to take more from him than it gave back. Nurses began hovering more often. Dr. Patel checked on us twice a day, sometimes 3. His face softened each time he saw Liam, then tightened when he turned to speak to me in the hallway. On Thursday, he finally said the words I had feared. "We are moving into a different stage, Rachel. Comfort care may need to be our focus." It took me a moment to understand what that meant. Comfort care. Gentle words for an unbearable truth. They meant there would be no treatment, no miracle, no more plans, just making sure my son wasn't in pain, as his small body failed him. I asked if there was anything at all, we could still do. He didn't answer right away. That told me everything. When I stepped back into the room, Liam was asleep again, his breathing uneven. I sat down beside him and simply listened. Every breath he took felt like a countdown that only I could hear. That same afternoon, I sent one final message to my parents. I told them everything, the urgency, the timeline, the fact that we were losing him. I didn't ask for money this time. I didn't beg. I just told them this was their last chance to see their grandson while he was still alive. My father responded 3 hours later. "We will try to visit tomorrow. We have meetings today about the wedding timeline and cannot cancel last minute." Meetings, centerpieces, timelines. My son was dying, and they were rearranging a seating chart. When they finally arrived the next day, they walked into the room with hesitant smiles, as if unsure how much emotion to show. They stood by the bed for 20 minutes, making small talk, telling Liam he would feel better soon, assuring me things would work out. Then my father checked his watch. "We should get going. The planner is expecting us." My mother nodded, brushing imaginary dust from her blouse. "Let us know if anything changes." Anything changes. As if we were discussing weekend weather. I didn't say a word as they left. I didn't trust myself to. That night, the storm finally broke. Liam woke up crying softly, clutching his chest. The monitors beeped sharply, and nurses rushed in. I moved out of their way, my hands trembling uncontrollably. His eyes found mine, wide and frightened. "Mom, it hurts." Those are the 2 words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I held his hand as they adjusted his oxygen and whispered that I was right there, that he wasn't alone, that I loved him more than anything. By sunrise, he was too weak to talk. Dr. Patel came in just after 8. His expression told me before his words did. It won't be long now. Time changed shape in that moment. Minutes felt like fragile glass, slipping and breaking faster than I could count them. I crawled into the bed beside Liam, held him against my chest, and hummed a song I used to sing when he was a baby. His breathing slowed, then slowed again. And then, somewhere in the pause between 2 breaths, he simply didn't take another. The world went silent. I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Grief distorts time in ways no clock can measure. When I finally stood up and walked into the hallway, my legs felt numb. I called my parents. My voice didn't sound like my own. I told them their grandson was gone. My mother's first words were, "Oh, Rachel, the timing is really unfortunate. We have rehearsal dinner tonight." I closed my eyes. That was the moment I realized my family wasn't broken. They were exactly who they had chosen to be all along. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt unseen by the people who should have loved you the most, just tell me with one short comment. Type the number 1. It helps more than you think to know we aren't alone in stories like this. Back in the hospital room, I stood over my son's still body and understood something with painful clarity. I had given him every ounce of love I had, and my family had given him nothing. What I didn't know then was that their choices, their distance, their selfishness, their coldness, would eventually come back to them. Not through my revenge, not through anger, but through the truth. And the truth, once spoken out loud, has a way of haunting the people who run from it. But that part of the story comes later. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, filling every corner of your life, settling into your bones like cold winter air. After Liam died, I moved through the world as if underwater. Sounds were muffled, colors were dull. Time passed, but I couldn't feel it. I remember signing papers, speaking to nurses, packing up his small collection of stuffed animals. I remember walking out of the hospital with an empty wheelchair beside me, because carrying it out felt easier than accepting that I no longer needed it. What I don't remember is breathing. The funeral home suggested a simple service. My parents agreed instantly, not because it was what Liam deserved, but because they didn't want the sadness to overshadow the week's events. My mother used soft phrases, like a small family moment, or a private goodbye, but I could hear the truth behind every word. They didn't want a real funeral. They didn't want people asking questions. They didn't want their friends showing up with sympathy that might clash with the excitement of a destination wedding. They didn't want to be inconvenienced by my child's death. The service was held 2 days later, in a room that felt too large for the handful of people who came. A few teachers I worked with, a couple of neighbors, the school nurse who had spent afternoons reading with Liam. My parents arrived 10 minutes late, whispering apologies about traffic. My father kept checking his phone. My mother kept smoothing the front of her blouse, glancing at the clock as if she had somewhere else to be. And of course, she did. They both left early, saying they needed to finish packing before their afternoon flight. I watched the door close behind them and felt something inside me shift permanently. Whatever string still connected us snapped right there in that empty funeral chapel. When the service ended, everyone hugged me and promised to support me however they could, and then they left. I was alone again, standing beside a table with Liam's framed photo and a single flickering candle. I touched the frame gently and whispered a promise. I told him I would find a way to live again, even if I didn't know how yet. And I told him I would never let the truth of what happened to him be erased, not by silence, not by convenience, and certainly not by a wedding. That afternoon, while I sat on the couch holding Liam's old blanket, my phone lit up with pictures from Greece. Yes, you heard that right. My parents, still smelling of the funeral home, had boarded their flight and begun posting before I even reached home. My mother wrote, "The happiest week of our lives begins now." The happiest. I stared at the words until they blurred. My grief didn't shock me anymore, but their joy loud, public, and spotless cut through me in a way I can't fully explain. It felt like watching someone paint over your memories, with colors so bright they burned your eyes. And here is the hook, the moment that keeps people listening, even when their hearts are breaking. This was the exact moment I realized my family was rewriting the story, erasing my son, erasing his suffering, erasing their own choices. And if I didn't hold on to the truth, no one else would. In the days that followed, while Madison posed on yachts and under fireworks, I did something very different. I opened a notebook and began writing. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but because the truth needed a home. I listed dates, phone calls, messages, screenshots, hospital notes, things my family had done, things they hadn't done. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a strategy, it was simply what grief looked like when a mother has nothing left to lose. Then, on the fourth night, something small but important happened. My Aunt Teresa called. She was the only person in the family who had quietly sent a few $100s when Liam first got sick. She didn't lecture me, she didn't offer advice, she just said, "I wish I had known how bad it was. I'm so sorry you went through that alone." And hearing those words, those 5 simple words, "You were not imagined," almost brought me to my knees. For the first time since Liam died, I cried not from despair, but because someone finally saw me. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or you've ever had to carry the truth alone, tap the like button. Not for me, but because stories like this deserve to be heard by more people who need to know they're not alone. One click helps push the truth further than silence ever could. After I hung up with Teresa, I opened my notebook again. But this time, I wasn't just writing to remember. I was writing to prepare, though I didn't understand that yet. I was creating something that would one day become the map of my family's undoing. Meanwhile, the images from Greece grew more extravagant. My sister in a ball gown, my father raising a champagne flute, my mother laughing under a spray of gold fireworks that looked painfully like the ones Liam used to draw. They celebrated loudly, and I grieved quietly. But here's something I didn't realize in that moment. Quiet grief has power. Quiet grief grows roots. Quiet grief remembers everything, and eventually, because life has a way of circling back, quiet grief becomes the very thing that turns the world upside down for the people who once believed they were untouchable. The part where everything changes for them, that comes later. Grief didn't end when the funeral did. It didn't end when the wedding photos stopped flooding my phone. It didn't end on the day Madison posted her honeymoon pictures, smiling on a white sand beach while holding a champagne flute in one hand and her new husband in the other. My grief didn't dissolve, it simply learned to live inside me, quieter but sharper, like a shard of glass under the skin. A month passed, then another. People stopped bringing casseroles. Friends hesitated to ask how I was doing. The world moved on, because that is what the world does. But inside my small house, time remained frozen in the moment my son took his last breath. I kept writing in the notebook, the one I had started in the days after Liam died. At first, it was just facts. Dates, conversations, screenshots, a timeline of everything my family had chosen, and everything they had refused to see. But slowly, that notebook became something else. A document of truth in a family that had spent years pretending to be perfect. In their world, weddings mattered. Image mattered, appearances mattered. Liam did not, and as the weeks went by, I watched them craft a new narrative of themselves. One where my loss never happened. One where they were loving parents and doting grandparents. One where their biggest hardship that year had been choosing between 2 luxury villa options. I thought nothing could hurt me anymore. I was wrong. 3 weeks after the wedding, my mother called. I stared at the phone for a long time before answering. She launched straight into her plans for a family Christmas portrait session. "Rachel, it's important we update the pictures. Our last ones look outdated." My voice felt foreign when I asked, "And where exactly is Liam in this new portrait?" There was a long pause. Then she said the kind of sentence only someone without a conscience could form. "We think it might be too painful for you to include reminders of him right now." Reminders. As if my child were a misplaced object. As if including his memory would spoil the aesthetic of their matching sweaters. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I opened the notebook again. But this time, not to mourn, not to remember. I looked at what I had created, a record so complete, so painfully accurate, that it captured exactly how a family could abandon a dying child while smiling for cameras. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that one day, it would matter. The months that followed were quiet but heavy. I returned to work, I started therapy, I learned how to get out of bed even on mornings when breathing felt like the hardest task in the world, and little by little, life began moving again, not forward, just moving. It wasn't until nearly 4 years later that everything changed. I got the news through a coworker who had seen a headline online. The corporation where my father had been a senior executive was under investigation for financial misconduct. Layoffs, lawsuits, pension freezes, a collapsing tower of wealth my parents had assumed would last forever. Days later, a mutual acquaintance told me that Madison's influencer sponsorships had dried up after Dylan's failed startup left them drowning in debt. Their perfect life was unraveling like cheap thread. At first, I felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, just nothing. But then, slowly, something inside me exhaled. For years I had believed karma was a myth because bad people seemed to live good lives without consequence. Yet here it was, the beginning of the shift I never expected. My parents tried calling me. I ignored them. They texted. I deleted their messages. It took nearly a month before my father finally sent a voicemail that made my blood run cold. "Rachel, we need your help. We're losing the house, the shrine to image, the altar where they built their reputation as a loving, dignified, generous couple, the glowing symbol they had chosen over my son. And here's the hook, the moment that invites discussion, debate, and reflection. When the people who abandoned your child come back years later begging for help, do you owe them anything at all? What does forgiveness look like when the wound was fatal? And what does justice look like when revenge isn't an act but a truth finally revealed? Comment what you think. I truly want to know where others draw the line." A week after the voicemail, a long message arrived. My parents explained everything: the foreclosure notice, the frozen retirement funds, the lawsuits looming over them like storm clouds. They said they didn't know where else to turn. They said they were sorry if things had felt tense at the time. They said they hoped we could move forward as a family. As a family, those 3 words felt like gravity shifting under my feet. The family that had left me alone in a cold hospital room. The family that had flown to Greece hours after my son's funeral. The family that had taken smiling portraits while refusing to see the empty seat where their grandson should have been. Now they wanted connection, unity, a shared battle against misfortune. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I pulled my notebook from the drawer, its pages worn, edges soft, ink smudged from the nights I cried while writing. It held everything, every truth they had refused to speak, every choice they had made, every moment where their comfort mattered more than my son's life. And for the first time, I understood something. This notebook wasn't just a record, it was leverage. The kind of leverage life gives you only once, and I was finally ready to use it. What happened next, the meeting, the confrontation, the truth spoken aloud, would change everything. For them, and for me. That part comes in the next chapter. By the time 4 years had passed since losing Liam, my life had changed in ways I never anticipated. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but piece by piece, the way a cracked foundation can be rebuilt slowly, patiently, with hands that have learned to work through pain. I had returned to school, finishing my master's degree in educational leadership. I had been promoted to principal of a small charter academy, where every hallway echo reminded me of the world Liam never got to grow into. I learned how to save again, how to breathe in silence without breaking, how to live with grief instead of being consumed by it. My parents, meanwhile, were living a story that sounded almost fictional when people whispered about it. There had been headlines, investigations, hearings. My father's fall from his executive position had been swift and brutal. The retirement funds they depended on had evaporated, lawsuits drained whatever savings they had left. Their home, once the immaculate symbol of their curated image, was now weeks away from foreclosure. Madison and Dylan weren't doing better. His failed startup had left them buried in debt. Her influencer brand lost appeal when sponsorships dried up. Their perfect facade had cracked open so publicly that people in their social circles avoided asking questions out of embarrassment. It was as if the universe had peeled back the curtains on all their illusions at once. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. But I also didn't feel the crushing sympathy a daughter is supposed to feel. When you've watched your child die while your family toasts champagne on another continent, pity becomes a foreign emotion. For weeks, my parents kept calling, asking to talk. I ignored every message until one night, a single sentence made me pause. "Rachel, we are out of options. Not we need you. Not we're sorry. Not tell us how you're doing. Just desperation, wrapped in entitlement." I sat with the voicemail for a long time. Then I opened my notebook, the ledger of truth I had built page by page after Liam died. The first page was dated the day my parents refused to help. The last page was the picture of Madison's wedding fireworks, posted the same night my son's ashes cooled. I stared at that notebook and realized something. They weren't asking their daughter for help. They were asking the girl they had abandoned to save them from the fallout of their own choices. But this story, the one life had written for all of us, was no longer theirs to direct. A week later, a letter arrived from the mortgage lender addressed to my parents. I never intended to open it, but seeing my mother's name, written in hurried blue ink, pulled something dark and old in me. Inside was a formal notice. They had 14 days before the foreclosure would be finalized. 14 days. For a family that hadn't given me one day of genuine support when I needed them most. That night, for the first time in years, I stood in front of the mirror and didn't look away. I saw the lines grief had carved into my face, the calm I had learned to build over years of silence, and the strength I didn't know I had until everything else was gone. The next morning, I called them. Both answered at once, breathless, as if they'd been waiting by the phone. "Rachel, honey, thank God you called. Where are you? We need to talk. We can come to your house right now." I told them to meet me on Saturday. At my home. At noon. And I hung up before they could say another word. The hours leading up to that meeting were heavier than I expected. I cleaned the house, though it didn't need it. I brewed coffee I wouldn't drink. I opened the notebook and placed it on the dining table, closed but waiting. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I felt something sharper, steadier, like standing on the edge of a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. When Saturday arrived, they pulled into the driveway with expressions I'd never seen before, faces drained not by grief, but by fear. Real, tangible fear. They stepped into my house, as if entering a courtroom. "Rachel, thank you for seeing us," my father said, swallowing hard. My mother's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for clues about what version of me she would face. Madison and her husband arrived minutes later, looking as fragile as porcelain figurines that had already been glued back together once. We all sat. A silence stretched between us, brittle and thick. Finally, my father spoke. "We're losing everything. The house, our savings, our retirement, everything we worked for, and we were hoping, praying that you could help us." Their voices trembled, their hands shook. They looked at me as if I were the last lifeline in a stormy sea. For a moment, I simply watched them. These were the same people who couldn't spare time for a dying child. The same ones who flew to Greece hours after his funeral. The same ones who rewrote the family narrative to remove the parts that made them look human instead of perfect. Now, they needed me. I opened the notebook slowly. My mother's breath caught. My father whispered, "What's that?" "The truth," I said. "All of it." I watched their faces drain of color. But here is the hook. The moment every listener stops breathing for just a second. Should a parent who abandoned their grandchild in his final days still have the right to ask for mercy years later? Or does the truth they ran from eventually become the only justice left to give? I looked each of them in the eye and said, "I will help you, but not the way you think," and that is where everything shifted. The next part of the story, the confrontation, the conditions, the breaking point, was about to begin. I did not open the notebook to hurt them. I opened it because the truth had waited long enough. The dining room was silent when I set it on the table, silent in the way a courtroom becomes silent before a verdict. My parents stared at it as if it were a weapon. Madison shifted uncomfortably, her diamond ring catching the light, a reminder of the wedding that started all of this. Dylan sat stiff, hands clasped so tight, his knuckles turned white. I watched them breathe. I watched them wait. And then, for the first time in years, I let myself speak the whole truth without softening a single word. "You came here today asking for help," I said quietly. "But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the choices that brought us here." My father straightened defensively. "Rachel, this isn't necessary." "It is," I interrupted, "because I lived through all of it, and you never once acknowledged any of it." I opened the notebook, and the room seemed to tighten around us. The first page. The day the doctor told us the treatment cost $90,000. The next page. The message where I begged them to help. The message they never answered. Another page. The receipt for the deposit on Madison's wedding venue in Greece. $250,000. Then, screenshots of wedding planning texts sent on the same days Liam was fainting in the hospital. Then, the photo they posted from the airport, smiling hours after leaving Liam's funeral early. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. My father's eyes lowered. Madison's face flushed red, a mix of shame and denial. "You kept records of all this," my father whispered. "I didn't keep records," I said. "I kept proof, because I knew one day you would pretend none of it happened." My mother's voice trembled. "Rachel, we didn't know it was this bad." "You did. You absolutely did. You chose not to see it. That's different." For years, they had rewritten the story to make themselves look better. But here, in this room, with every page laid out like evidence, there was nowhere left for them to hide. I took a slow breath. "You say you're losing your home, that you're scared, that you have nowhere else to turn. But you need to understand something. I lost my son, and during the worst moments of my life, every one of you turned your backs on us." Silence again. Heavy, thick. Dylan spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, what do you want us to say?" "The truth," I replied. My father's jaw tightened. "Rachel, we're trying to move forward." "No, moving forward requires looking back honestly. You don't get to skip that part." I reached into the folder beside the notebook and pulled out a sheet of paper. Their eyes widened as they realized it wasn't more evidence this time. It was a contract. "You want $100,000 to save the house," I said. "I can loan it to you, today, right now." Hope flashed in their eyes. "But there are two conditions." Their hope faltered. Fear returned. "First, each of you will say out loud clearly that when Liam needed help, you had the money, and you chose not to give it. No excuses, no softening. The exact truth." My mother shook her head slowly. "Rachel, that's cruel. Cruel as leaving your grandson to die alone while you taste wedding menus in Santorini." Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't argue again. "Second," I continued, "you will sign these documents agreeing to have no contact with me ever again. No calls, no texts, no pretending we're still a family. This loan will be the last thing you ever receive from me." Madison gasped. "You want to cut us out of your life. You cut yourselves out the day you boarded that plane," I said. Their faces broke fear, shame, disbelief. They looked at each other, searching for an ally. There was none. Finally, my father spoke, his voice hoarse. "And if we refuse, then the foreclosure proceeds as scheduled," I said simply. "Your home is gone." For a long time, no one moved. I watched the turmoil cross their faces, pride collapsing, ego shattering, image crumbling beneath the truth, and beneath it all, the realization that they had finally run out of people to blame. After nearly a minute, my father stood. His hands trembled. "Fine. I'll say it." He turned toward the daughter he had once dismissed as dramatic, difficult, inconvenient, and said the sentence I had carried alone for years. "We had the money. We chose not to help. We failed Liam." My mother's breath broke. She whispered the same words. Madison followed, crying openly now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. One by one, they signed the documents. And just like that, the story they had rewritten for years unraveled at the seams. Not because I forced them to speak the truth, but because the truth had been waiting all along, patient and heavy, like a stone on their doorstep. I wrote the check. I placed it on the table. My mother reached for it with trembling hands. I didn't comfort her. As they turned to leave, none of them could meet my eyes. But here is the hook, the question that splits audiences down the middle, sparking debate every time this story is told. When someone finally faces the consequences of their own choices, is it justice or is it revenge? Think about it, because the next part of the story might just change your answer. When the door finally closed behind them, the house fell quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not heavy, not hollow, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has ripped through and left only clean air behind. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the signed documents on my dining table, the confessions they never intended to make, the truth they spent years avoiding. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was something closer to balance, as if the world had finally tilted back toward a shape that made sense. They had spoken the truth, out loud, with no escape, no performance, no pretending. For the first time since Liam died, I felt like I could breathe without counting each inhale. I placed the check inside an envelope, sealed it, and left it on the table for a pickup service that would deliver it directly to the mortgage company. I didn't give it to them directly. I didn't trust my father not to use it for something else. Saving the house was the last thread tying me to them, and I wanted that thread to snap on my terms. When everything was done, I sat on the couch and stared at the notebook, not as evidence anymore, but as the history of a family that had finally been forced to confront itself. But something inside me whispered, "It isn't finished yet," because a truth spoken once in a room full of shame is still a fragile truth. It needs light, it needs air, it needs witnesses, not revenge, not cruelty, just balance. The world had believed for years that my parents were kind, generous pillars of the community. Madison was adored as the daughter who had it all, beauty, a perfect marriage, the parents who spoiled her rotten. People looked at their family photos and saw a fairy tale. No one knew what happened behind the curtain, but I did, and now, so did they. I picked up the notebook and began making copies, not for the whole world, not to humiliate them, but for the people who had once asked quietly, what really happened with Liam, the relatives who had sensed something was off, the church members who wondered why my parents never mentioned their grandson, the few people who still believed truth comes before reputation. I sent each copy with a short note. "This is what happened. I don't need anything from you. I only need the truth to live somewhere other than my grief." I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, the ripple reached my doorstep. Aunt Teresa called first. Her voice cracked when she said, "I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined it was this." Then came a message from an old pastor who had presided over family events for years. "Rachel, I had no idea. I am ashamed I never asked." Then a cousin who lived states away wrote simply, "They deserved this truth. You deserved it more." None of them were angry at me. Not one. If anything, their voices were full of the outrage I had been too exhausted to feel. Because that's what the truth does, it chooses sides without you having to push it. Meanwhile, back in my parents' neighborhood, the shift was immediate. My uncle told me people stopped waving at them during morning walks. Madison's friends quietly removed her from group chats. The family who once basked in admiration now avoided community events altogether. And according to one neighbor, my parents requested a leave of absence from their church duties, though no one had asked them to step down. They thought losing the house would be their greatest humiliation. They were wrong. Losing the version of themselves they worked so hard to project, that was the wound they couldn't hide. I didn't watch it happen firsthand. I wasn't interested in their downfall. That wasn't mine to tend to. I was interested in my peace, and for the first time in years, it felt within reach. One afternoon I walked to the school memorial garden, something I had built the year after Liam passed. A small tree grew there now, tall and strong, its leaves shifting in the wind like soft applause. I placed my hand on the trunk. "I kept my promise," I whispered. The truth didn't stay buried. For the first time, the grief didn't feel sharp. It felt honest. And honesty, I had learned, is a kind of healing. As I stood there beneath the branches, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel vengeance. I didn't even feel satisfaction. I felt done. But here is the twist, the hook that makes people argue in the comments section every single time I tell this story. Was I wrong to expose the truth? Did I go too far? Or did they finally get the consequences they earned? Tell me what you think, and if you need something lighter after all that, tell me which family member you think would last longest on a reality show about avoiding accountability. I have my guesses. Standing beneath the tree, I let the wind wash over me. My son's memory deserved the truth, my life deserved peace. And as for my parents, they now lived in a world shaped by the choices they made long before they ever came to my door. But the final chapter, the part where I found real closure, was still waiting ahead. In the weeks after the truth quietly spread through the community, something unexpected happened. Not to my parents, not to Madison, but to me. For the first time since Liam died, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift, not because anything external had healed, but because the truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It lived out in the open now, where lies couldn't suffocate it, and silence couldn't bury it. My parents kept their distance. They honored the documents they signed, and never attempted contact, not through calls, not through letters, not even through distant relatives acting as messengers. The absence felt strange at first, like a room that had always contained noise, suddenly going still. But after a while, that stillness felt like air returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. Their reputation crumbled in slow, quiet waves. People stopped inviting them to charity events. The church ladies who once admired my mother now whispered behind hymnal books. My father, once the polished executive who gave lectures on leadership, avoided grocery stores in daylight. Their social world, the world they had valued more than their grandson's life, collapsed brick by brick. But I never watched it unfold directly. That was their chapter, not mine. Mine began somewhere else entirely. One evening, after locking up the school building, I walked out to the memorial garden where Liam's tree now towered above the benches. The sky was turning amber, the air cool enough to feel new again. The leaves rustled in a way that made it sound as though the tree was breathing. I sat on the bench and rested my hand against the bark. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "I protected your truth, and I'm learning to live again, in a world that still has room for you." For the first time, I didn't cry. Not because the pain was gone, grief never disappears, but because my heart finally understood something. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in balance restored and lies undone, in the peace that follows truth spoken aloud. As I sat there, my mind drifted back to the day my parents stood in my dining room, trembling as they confessed the choice they had made. And I realized something surprising, something I didn't expect to feel: pity. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, but pity for the lives they had wasted chasing admiration from people who now crossed the street to avoid them, for the love they had traded for perfection, for the family they could have had if they had ever chosen compassion over appearances. Their punishment was not mine to deliver. Life had done that for me. But what mattered most was this: I was free. I rose from the bench and walked toward the parking lot when I spotted someone standing by the gate, a familiar figure. Aunt Teresa. She had been one of the few who quietly offered help years ago, long before she ever knew the details. She smiled softly. "I hope you know you did the right thing, Rachel." I returned the smile. "I didn't want revenge," I said. "I wanted the truth to live somewhere besides me, and now it does," she replied. We talked for a few minutes about life, work, the weather, small things that carried no weight. Before leaving, she squeezed my hand gently. "He would be proud of you," she said. As she walked away, the evening light caught the branches of the tree, and for a moment, the leaves shimmered like they were lit from within. I stood there, letting the last of the sun warm my face, and felt the kind of peace that doesn't need to be named to be understood. Over the next few months, I continued building my life not around my grief, but with it. I joined a local volunteer group for families facing medical crises. I donated part of my savings in Liam's honor, and slowly, my home began to feel less like a place shaped by loss and more like a space shaped by resilience. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found the notebook, the ledger that had once been the center of everything. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages, every date, every message, every truth. Then I closed it one final time. I didn't burn it. I didn't tear it apart. I placed it gently in a drawer and walked away from it, not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed it to carry me. The truth had done its job. The balance had been restored. And my life, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to me again. But here is the hook, the part that stays with people long after they've heard the story. When justice finally arrives, quietly and honestly, it doesn't erase the pain, but it does free you from the people who caused it. If you've ever carried a truth alone, or fought for your own peace the way I did, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories told with honesty, heart, and the kind of endings that make you think long after the screen goes dark, make sure to hit subscribe. There are more stories waiting. Stories that begin where silence ends,